Hey everyone! Thanks for tuning in to the first part of the American Civil War iceberg. By now, you probably already know the iceberg drill, so I'll be getting straight into the surface of this iceberg chart, which was created by U/Captain Crustacean. For this video, we'll be covering the first 4 tiers of the iceberg. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe to my small channel, and if you enjoyed this iceberg specifically, make sure to check out other videos on my channel and hit the bell so you can stay tuned for more content. Now that that's all said and done, let's get right into this iceberg.
Oh, way down south in the land of traders, rattlesnakes and alligators, right away.
The Civil War started over slavery. This is a powerfully simple statement that accurately summarizes why the American Civil War started. Many people in the North and South were disgusted by slavery, which was the backbone of agriculture in the South. Northern states wanted to ban slavery, but the South couldn't get over the fact that they would lose their slaves, so they formed their own government and attacked the North. So, the creation of the Gatling gun is a much more interesting story than just someone making a weapon to help a war effort. In 1862, Richard Jordan Gatling created the Gatling gun. It was the first reliable machine gun invented, and it sat on a cart and was made from 6 barrels that turned as a crank was operated. When each barrel grazed the magazine, it loaded and shot a bullet. This thing could shoot 200 rounds a minute, which is very impressive. But what's more impressive is why Gatling created it. Gatling studied medicine, though he never practiced, and instead he made and sold inventions for farmers. He lived in Indiana, and though he was originally from the South, he was a huge supporter of the Union. Having studied medicine, he was appalled by how many soldiers were dying to disease and wanted to create an efficient gun that could cut down soldiers better than bayonets. You see, many soldiers used bayonets in the war, which spread a ton of disease. In fact, 2/3 of Civil War death casualties were from disease, not bullets. So Gatling wanted to create a weapon that would be more humane than a disease-carrying knife, and one that would maybe convince people not to have large-scale battles. So this Gatling guy might first come off as horrible for creating the first machine gun, but he actually did it for pretty noble reasons, and on the whole, he was a pretty good guy. The Civil War started over states' rights. This is an argument that the Civil War wasn't started over slavery, but the right of states to own slaves and not be trampled out by the federal government. A lot of times this is just essentially an argument used by those trying to defend the Confederacy and make the Confederacy less about slavery and sort of justify their actions a little bit. And technically both of those arguments are correct if you combine them to say the Civil War started over states' rights to own slaves. It's pretty ridiculous. King Cotton was a phrase used in the South by politicians to convince citizens that a separation from the United States would be possible without a war. Essentially what this phrase meant was that cotton was such a valuable commodity that if the cotton-producing South were to split from the greater United States, the new nation would be able to support itself economically off this commodity alone. While it did convince many people to support the secession, we all know how it turned out for the South in the end. The Battle of Gettysburg was the largest and bloodiest battle during the American Civil War. The 3-day conflict claimed 50,000 lives, and the Union victory marked a huge turning point in the war. It's a gigantic event, so I won't go into it in incredible detail here, but I highly encourage reading about it if you have the time. The Battle of Antietam took place on September 17, 1862, just 4 days before the Emancipation Proclamation was announced. It was an important battle that stopped the advancing Confederate troops during their invasion of Maryland, which was the closest the South would ever get to the capital of Washington, D.C. It's one of the most important battles of the Civil War. The Anaconda Plan was a strategy proposed by Union General Winfield Scott early on in the war. It called for a naval blockade of the Confederacy, suffocating their forces from the sea. It mostly focused on blocking ports and was seen by other Union generals as way too tame at the time. The general actually thought that this would end the war quickly and bloodlessly through making sure the economy of the Confederacy wouldn't work. Lincoln was skeptical of the plan, but did use blockades in combination with a large ground force. So the plan to strangle southern ports did help, but not exactly the way Scott originally intended. It's hotly debated amongst historians whether this original plan would have worked and ended the Confederacy economically, but what do you guys think? Sherman's march to the sea involved Union General William T. Sherman marching 60,000 soldiers 285 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. After the hub city of Atlanta had fallen to the Union, Sherman wanted to march his men throughout Georgia peacefully as a scare tactic to get the Georgian people to abandon the Confederacy. See, Sherman believed the strength of the South came from the moral and material support of Southern whites, so he decided to absolutely scare the crap out of them by marching troops through their towns, stealing food, and occasionally burning buildings of those who resisted, but otherwise somewhat peacefully. That's absolutely awesome. The Andersonville prison camp, located in Camp Sumter, was a Confederate POW camp used during the final 14 months of the war. This was not a good place to be. The conditions were beyond terrible, and of the 45,000 Union troops there, around 13,000 died, mostly from disease. The leader of the camp, Captain Henry Wurz, would be tried and executed for his war crimes during this camp's operation. The idea that the South was doomed from the start is pretty easy to understand. One simple metric is population. The Union had a population of 22 million, while the South had only 9 million, 3.5 of which were slaves. On top of that, the North had more railroads, more coal, more iron, and much better leadership. Looking back, there aren't really a lot of well-accepted theories as to how the South actually could have won the Civil War.
Come away, where cotton's king and men are chattels. Union boys will win the battles right away.
The Emancipation Proclamation read that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforth shall be, free. While this was a huge step, and it meant so much to the newly freed Americans, making the war about freedom as well, it didn't actually free any slaves. There were some Union-controlled areas of the Confederacy that still had slaves, and obviously the Confederacy didn't care that the Union had made a decree on their behalf. It was still an incredible deal, though, and importantly, it allowed freed slaves to fight for the Union, which was incredibly noble after everything they had been through. General Lee's Lost Order, or Special Order 191, was a letter written by General Lee intended for the Army of Northern Virginia during the beginning of the Maryland invasion. It gave detailed information on the movements of troops, which would split into groups and then reconvene later. Somehow, it ended up laying in the grass in a campground and was discovered by Corporal Barton W. Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Volunteers. It's debated how much this information actually helped the Union because Major General McClellan thought the information might have been a trap, but he did eventually help kick the Confederates out of Maryland. The Battle of Monitor and Merrimack, which occurred on March 9, 1862, was the first duel between two iron warships, a critical junction in naval warfare. The Merrimack was a Northern ship, but it had been recovered by the Confederates at the Norfolk Navy Yard and renamed the Virginia. It had decimated Union wooden ships before its duel with the 172-foot Monitor, which was notable for its revolving gun turret. The two met for a dramatic duel, with Northern and Southerners watching from a nearby port, but no one on either side really knew how to use these new ships. The Virginia quickly hit the Monitor, causing an explosion which drove iron splinters into the eyes of Lieutenant John Worden, who was in charge of the ship. The Monitor began to leave for shallow water, and the Virginia, which was well damaged, concluded that the Monitor was disabled and left for the Norfolk Navy Yard. Hearing this story is a little interesting to me because I feel like so many of us have a conception that the Civil War is just ancient because of all these black and white photos and such, but with things like iron ships and machine gun turrets, it's just so much more modern than it looks like at first glance. Confederate gold refers to a cache of gold that's gone unaccounted for since the end of the war. As Union troops were about to invade New Orleans, the Confederates moved a bunch of gold to Columbus, Georgia, where, after changing hands a bit amongst Confederate units, it disappeared. It's never been found, and it's been a hot topic amongst treasure hunters and historians for years. The Battle of the Wilderness was the first battle of General Ulysses S. Grant's campaign to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. This extremely bloody battle didn't really have a clear winner, but it marked a shift for the Confederates to a more defensive approach during the war. Southern secession over slavery did cause the Civil War. While the entire story of secession is very complicated, it can be summed up by the Confederate states voting to leave the Union after Abe Lincoln, a president who was against slavery, got elected. Worried that he would abolish slavery, these states eventually left to form the Confederacy. So there was no official Confederate Secret Service, though the Confederate Congress drafted a plan to establish one, which never went through. There were various secret groups that worked in the Confederacy. the full whereabouts of many of which are still unknown due to files being destroyed during the fall of the Confederacy. These groups included traditional spies, foreign agents, the Signal Corps, the Torpedo Bureau, and many more. It's also known that some Confederate agents worked in Canada, but again, we aren't entirely sure what happened there. Confederate political parties. So, it's been noted that, oddly enough, the Confederate States Congress actually worked pretty smoothly together, and many of the representatives were moderate, well, by their own standards, of course. There weren't new parties, but most of the congressmen were former Democrats, and a small number were former Whigs. The CSS Alabama was a screw sloop of war ship built by the John Layard and Sons Company for the Confederacy. She spent her 2-year career as a commerce raider and, interestingly, never actually docked at a southern port. She was eventually sunk outside France at the Battle of Cherbourg in 1864. The CSS Florida was a sloop of war ship that, similarly to the Alabama, acted as a commerce raider until she was sunk in 1864. Her journey is pretty interesting, however. She was built in Liverpool and, to avoid suspicion of being sent to Confederate territory, sailed for Nassau. The governor of Nassau decided not to let the boat dock, so they went to Green Cay instead, where she was commissioned into the Confederacy. Since they didn't make their original stop, they were able to get rations but not weapons. As they set off, yellow fever began to spread throughout the ship, so they had to make a stop in Cuba before getting back to Confederate territory. Then the Florida made a mad dash for Alabama, where she was shot at by Union forces and, unable to fight back, somehow just made it through a blockade by going as fast as possible and finally making it to Mobile, Alabama. Confederate guerrillas. There was actually a large amount of guerrilla warfare that went on during the Civil War. Much of it was extremely violent and even included some war crimes. A good example of this is William C. Quantrill, who was a school teacher and gambler who formed a guerrilla gang once the war started. He was quickly labeled as an outlaw by the Union, and he did pretty well harassing and killing Union soldiers. In his gang, though, included many soon-to-be infamous bank robbers, including Jesse James. So this guy wasn't running an honorable crowd whatsoever.
I wish I was in Baltimore. I'd make secession traitors roar right away.
Confederados is a Portuguese word for the around 20,000 Confederate immigrants to Brazil and their descendants at the end of the Civil War. After the war, many Confederates hoped to lead slave-owning lifestyles in Brazil, where slavery was still legal, so they moved there hoping to produce cotton. These Confederados spread throughout the country, and they still have an organization called the Fraternity of American Descendants, where they meet up and dress up as Confederates and eat Southern food. This is really, really strange to me because, by now these people are 100% Brazilian, but they're still sort of supporting history of another country. It's just a strange vibe overall. The H.L. Hunley was one of the first submarines ever, and it was used by the Confederacy during the Civil War. It actually sunk a Union ship, and by the end of her short career, 21 men died inside the sub because it sank 3 separate times. An examination of the wreckage years later also suggested that it was destroyed because of its own torpedo exploding when it was attacking a Union blockade in 1864. The Confederate double-barreled cannon was an experimental cannon that was never actually used in battle. While it was conceptualized around 200 years earlier, it was built by a Georgia dentist and inventor John Gilland, who tried to pitch it to the Confederates, who didn't really find it that useful. When he tested it, the cannonballs shot in 2 separate directions, one of which smacked and killed a cow, and all in all, the design was just a failure. Somehow, it disappeared in 1891, but was found 12 years later and now stands in display in Athens, Georgia. The USS Alligator was the first submarine used by the United States Navy. This Union craft was extremely experimental and unfortunately did not fare very well. Many tests were conducted, some of which Abe Lincoln was actually able to see, but on her first real deployment, she was being towed by the Sumter, and when they encountered bad weather, the Sumter had to cut the Alligator loose, where it promptly sunk, ending the career of the first U.S. submarine in 1863. The Free and Independent State of Scott was a movement in the southern state of Tennessee where Scott County declared itself free and independent after Tennessee's decision to align with the Confederacy. It became an enclave for Union troops, and and interestingly, never officially rescinded its independence until 1986, though by that point it was very much symbolic and not official in any capacity. The reason this county in particular acted the way it did was because it was part of East Tennessee, which wasn't as reliant on slaves as the rest of the state. And in fact, in the county, there were only 61 slaves. The county court approved the Declaration of Independence, and soon after, the governor of Tennessee sent 1,700 troops to quell what he saw was a rebellion. However, the locals managed to fend off these troops, which couldn't make it to the capital of Scott, Huntsville. In the end, the community was of little strategic value, and there would only be a few skirmishes in the Free State throughout the war. This is an amazing story of people in a small but tight-knit community standing up for what they believed in the face of huge resistance. The Angel of Mary's Heights was a Confederate soldier named Richard Kirkland. He is known for his courageous and kind actions during the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862. At the battle, the Confederates had inflicted many Union casualties, and the battlefield lay with Union soldiers, many of whom were still alive. They screamed throughout the night, but neither side wanted to venture into no man's land in fear of getting shot. Eventually, Kirkland approached an officer and asked if he could help the soldiers. While the officer at first said no, he relented and said that Kirkland could help, but he couldn't wave a white flag, to which Kirkland responded, "All right, sir, I'll take my chances." He grabbed as many canteens of water as he could, along with blankets and warm clothing, and walked into the battlefield. He continued to make troops for over an hour until he helped every soldier, Confederate and Union, that he could. Fort Monroe was built in Hampton Roads, Virginia, around Chesapeake Bay. Built in 1819, it was the only military base in the South that remained under Union control during the Civil War. It acted as a beacon of hope for slave refugees who were housed there. The fort has a rich history that surpassed the Civil War, as it was actively used during World War I and World War II, and you could still visit it today. Confederate Native Americans. Upwards of 7,860 Native Americans fought for the Confederate Army during the American Civil War, but their history and connection to the war is much more interesting than just that. So after many Native Americans had been removed from their land in 1830, many were forced into Oklahoma, which at the time was just designated as Native American territory. Foreseeing the outbreak of the war, Union troops were pulled out of the area, leaving it completely unprotected. The Confederacy wanted the land as it could be used as a valuable source of materials such as food if the Union created a blockade. So as Confederates moved in on the territory, many nations, under duress, signed treaties to help the Confederacy in exchange for some political rights. Many thought they would receive better political standing if they allied with the Confederacy, but very few Native Americans actually owned slaves or supported the Confederate cause in general. You can't really compare their fighting to the fighting of white Confederates. There were a couple of skirmishes, and I could tell you stories about those soldiers, or I could tell you a cooler story. What happened to the Native Americans in this territory that wanted to go to the Union? Well, let me tell you about Creek Principal Chief Apithlia Hoya, who bravely took those who did not want to give up Creek lands and supported the Union all the way to Texas, fighting Confederates along the journey. Their arduous journey became known as the Trail of Blood on Ice because of the horrible conditions and battles they fought along the way. Apithlia Hoya eventually made it, though he did pass away in one of the refugee camps in Kansas. The Gray Ghost was the nickname given to a Confederate Army Cavalry Battalion commander named John S. Mosby. He led the 43rd Battalion, which was a battalion of partisan cavalry. So, while the Gray Ghost reported to General Lee, he wasn't quite part of the Army, though to be clear, he was 100% a Confederate, he just led his own subgroup. The 43rd Battalion conducted lots of guerrilla warfare, and their group was well known for successfully annoying the Union with their irregular tactics. Mosby later became an attorney and was viewed by a traitor to the South because he worked with U.S. President Grant, who was once the great Union general. He got involved with Virginia's politics and also served in the Department of Justice and as the U.S. consul to Hong Kong. Post-war Confederate holdouts. After the surrender of the CSS Shenandoah, which marked the last official Confederate surrender, it would be almost a year until President Johnson officially declared an end to the war, saying that, quote, declaring the peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. So, what happened in between those 2 points? Well, not much, but before that, in April of 1864, President Johnson had already declared that the war was pretty much over. The problem was that there were many Confederate armies under the command of different generals, and when General Lee surrendered, many different actors, such as the Confederate Native Americans, had to surrender as well, and some took longer than others. Here's a pretty good timeline that explains the process. The CSS Shenandoah was a Confederate ship with a rich history, concluding with her having fired the last shot of the American Civil War. On top of that, her flag was the last official Confederate flag to be furled. Originally a British merchant ship, she became a feared commerce raider and operated all over the world. We'll be talking about her a little bit later on. John Wilkes Booth was an early oil investor. So, John Wilkes Booth got into the oil investing game, and while he had an impact on it, he lost a ton of money. Booth was a popular actor born into a reputable family, but around 1863, he started developing a cough that eventually forced him to quit acting. It could have been bronchitis or just him not taking care of his vocal cords, but either way, in 1864, he performed in his last play and then left the theater to try to strike it rich in oil. At that time, most oil came from whales, which were quickly declining in population, so the world needed a new source of oil. People rushed towards the newly designed oil wells, and Booth convinced two theater friends to create the Dramatic Oil Company with him. They leased 3.5 acres of land to drill oil, and while they made money at first, they wanted to increase production to help offset some costs. Their idea was to blow up part of the well using black powder to expand the well and get more oil, which they tried, but the explosion ruined the well and thus the entire investment. Booth ended up losing $6,000, which today is worth almost $100,000. The Battle of Cherbourg was a naval battle during the Civil War where the CSS Alabama, brought up earlier, was sunk by the USS Kearsarge. The Alabama attempted to dock in Cherbourg after 5 successful commerce raid operations, but the Kearsarge, which had been chasing the Alabama for 2 years, found her at the port on June 14, 1864. Initially, the Kearsarge could not attack because the ship was docked at a French port, and the captain of the Alabama used this to his advantage, drilling his soldiers for the impending battle. When it was time to leave, the Alabama was escorted by the French ship Caron, whose job it was to ensure that the battle took place away from the French harbor. The battle lasted just under an hour before the Alabama began to sink, and she kept fighting until eventually a Confederate soldier began to wave a white flag, at which point the Kearsarge moved in and picked up the Confederate survivors.
We'll put the traitors all to rout. I'll bet my boots we'll whip 'em out right away.
We'll kick off this next tier with the Bayou St. John submarine. Like the Hunley, this craft was built by the Confederacy, but many details about it remain a mystery. It was scuttled, or intentionally sunk, probably to prevent the Union from capturing her, and rediscovered in 1878 while Bayou St. John was being dredged. No documentation whatsoever from the Civil War exists about it, and its real name, purpose, or any details whatsoever are completely unknown. The tie elephants to Lincoln is a particularly interesting story. It starts with a letter sent by a Thai diplomat to President Lincoln which detailed a plan for elephants to be brought to America as a gift from the country, which was then called Siam. As interesting of a gesture this was, Lincoln would decline them, writing that America, quote, does not reach a latitude so far as to favor the multiplication of the elephant, and that steam on land as well as water has been our best and most efficient agent of transportation in internal commerce. The Battle of Cold Harbor, which occurred near Mechanicsburg, Virginia from May 31st to June 12, 1864, saw thousands of Union troops lost as they helplessly tried to storm a fortified Confederate position. General Grant, who led the assault, would later write in his memoir that he seriously regretted the attack. Winnan steam gun was a steam-powered centrifugal gun used by the Union. Instead of gunpowder, it was powered by steam, which spun the barrel and also moved the carriage that the gun sat on. It was feared on the battlefield for its gruesome look, and it shot a 2-ounce cannonball. The Hall carbine affair refers to John Piermont Morgan buying 5,000 rifles for $3.50 and then selling them to the government for $22 each. Morgan was a huge businessman, and his wealth at the time of his death equaled $1.2 billion in today's money. Anyway, when the news of this scam broke, it was a huge controversy, especially because the rifles were very dangerous to the user of them, since they were low quality and could blow off the user's thumb. Oh, and does that name sound familiar? That's because this guy founded JP Morgan, the huge bank that still exists today. The other Abraham Lincoln refers to Private Abraham B. Lincoln, second cousin of President Lincoln, who fought in the Confederate Army. Both Abes had actually sent some letters to one another before the war, and they knew of each other's existence. The Confederate Lincoln, who was from Virginia, would end up deserting from the Confederate Army and returning to his family. He would die in 1905. The other Jefferson Davis. In a similar vein to the previous entry, the other Jefferson Davis refers to Jefferson Columbus Davis, a Union officer who shared the same name of the President of the Confederacy, also Jefferson Davis. While this officer Davis was a distinguished leader, his career was defined by one big event, which I'll go ahead and explain. After a short break from duty, Officer Davis reported to General William Nelson, who, dissatisfied with Davis's performance, insulted him in front of some other people. Davis demanded the courtesy of his rank, and the general said, quote, "I will treat you as you deserve. You have disappointed me, you have been unfaithful to the trust which I reposed in you, and I shall relieve you at once. You are relieved from duty here." Davis later asked Nelson for a public apology, to which Nelson disagreed, so Davis went and got a pistol and shot Nelson in the chest, and he would die a half hour later. Funny thing is, David didn't get punished at all because he immediately confessed to the crime, explaining what happened, and officers were extremely valuable to the Union, so he pretty much just returned to duty like nothing happened, after he literally shot a Union general. The Central Confederacy was a proposed but never implemented state which would have composed of the middle and border states after the formation of the Confederacy. This planned confederacy, thought up by Senator John Pendleton Kennedy and Governor Thomas Hicks, both from Maryland, would contain the states of Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, North Carolina, and Maryland. Kennedy wrote a pamphlet called The Border States in December of 1860, and many people actually supported his rhetoric in the beginning, but that changed for many when the South attacked Fort Sumter, kicking off the Civil War, and fortunately, this other confederacy was never created. Hunt's flying machine was a planned aircraft drafted by Dr. R. Findlay Hunt, a dentist with little engineering knowledge, that he thought could be used by the Confederacy. He drew up these plans and sent them to the chief of the Engineer Bureau for the Confederacy, who naturally said something along the lines of, "This guy has absolutely no clue what he's doing, and this machine has zero chance of flying." Hunt quickly appealed this report from the Engineer Bureau, saying that the Board of Engineers didn't understand his idea properly. The craft involved the use of a steam engine that was known at the time to be way too heavy to get off the ground. Modern review of the plans conclude that the machine definitely would not have worked, and this is only one example of people trying to create aircraft during the war. The only ones that would actually be used would be reconnaissance balloons, but even those weren't used that often. Jewish Confederates. There were 2,000 Jewish Confederates living in the Confederacy during the time of the Civil War, mainly Sephardi Jews who had been living in the South for a while, and Ashkenazi Jews who were mainly immigrants from Prussia. Some of these Confederates are well known, but on the whole, the study of Jewish Confederates has been overlooked a lot in the realm of Civil War history. That was until Robert N. Rosen published his book, The Jewish Confederates, in 2001, which details many stories from these Confederates, and while I haven't read it myself, it looks pretty interesting. General Stand Watie was a Cherokee politician serving as the second principal chief of the Cherokee Nation for a time. He was also the only Native American Confederate general officer during the Civil War. He commanded Native American forces during the war and was the last Confederate general to surrender. The Confederate government of West Virginia is about, well, West Virginia, which was the only American state to have been created during and because of the Civil War. West Virginia is made up of some 50 counties of Virginia bordering Ohio and Pennsylvania where people had much Union sentiment, despite Virginia seceding and joining the Confederacy. On June 20th, 1863, the Unionist government in Wheeling, Virginia, with the approval of the American Congress and President Lincoln, formed the new state of West Virginia. Though technically a Union state, many West Virginians flocked to or supported the Confederacy, and the Union Army would have to deal with civil unrest in the state for years after the war ended because of this divide. The last Confederates surrendered in Liverpool. So, remember the CSS Shenandoah? She held the last Confederate soldiers to surrender, which did occur in the waters off Liverpool. Nothing much to say here, it's just interesting that the American Civil War ended near Liverpool. Jack Hinson, or Old Jack, was a prosperous farm owner who acted as a sniper for the Confederacy. But his story is much, much more dark, yet interesting than any regular soldier. Originally neutral in the war, he actually invited Union General Grant into his home when he was conducting an assault in the area. However, his two sons were out hunting, and they were mistaken by Union troops for the enemy, and they were both killed and decapitated. Not only that, but Hinson was forced out of his home, which was later burned, and didn't get any payment from the Union. Devastated, he led a personal war against the Union using his 50 caliber long rifle, and he killed upwards of 100 Union soldiers. There are actually 36 notches on his rifle, which many have suggested to mean kills of officers, though some believe it means he only killed 36 people. After the war, he returned to a peaceful life and died in his home in 1874. White House seances. During the Civil War, there were several seances held in the White House. To understand why, we have to look at how, during the American Civil War, which was the bloodiest conflict America has ever seen, death was so rampant, and with it being difficult to communicate and difficult to recover bodies, the grieving process was interrupted for many people. Because of this circumstance, many people turned towards spiritualistic approaches like communicating with the dead to help them grieve. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, who, grief-stricken after the loss of her and Abe's son, Willie, to fever, decided to get in touch with local mediums who helped her host upwards of 8 seances in the White House, which potentially Lincoln attended at least some of them. According to Mary Lincoln, it worked. She told her half-sister that, quote, "Willie lives. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of the bed with the same sweet, adorable smile that he always had. He does not always come alone. Little Eddie, the other Lincoln's son who died during childhood, is sometimes with him." Given the way most Americans view this type of spiritualism today, it's absolutely insane that this happened in the White House by a politician, and these events have actually fueled many of the White House ghost stories. Alright everyone, with that entry, we mark the end of Tier 4 and Part 1 of this Iceberg explanation series. I hope you enjoyed, and I'd love to have you subscribe so you can stay tuned for Part 2, which is coming soon. To give you a little teaser, we'll be talking about a camel, the Pope, and Lincoln's dreams about his own assassination. I hope to have you back for the next video, and in the meantime, have a good one. See y'all soon.